This is me. I'm Phil Meredith. I teach at Escape Studios as program leader for the Games Art course. I've been working in video games for around 15 years now, maybe. I think I started in 2006, so on Runescape many years ago when it was known as old school Runescape, I suppose. And from there, moving on to Climax to work on Silent Hill, Shattered Memories. That was really good fun. And the Overlord projects as well. That was really cool. And after that, moved on to EA to do some of the later Harry Potter games, and then was working at Rebellion on some other games that you probably wouldn't have heard of, things like Never Dead and a few mobile games and things. So I've seen quite a wide spectrum of video game art over the years, starting at the very, very simple with RuneScape, which was almost, I think it was the first of its kind, really, an MMO that was entirely online, that didn't require a CD. So super optimized to working on quite high-end games with that later on in my career. So, and obviously now I've been teaching for the last 7 years now, I think, 4 years at Escape. And that's me. And I do teach quite a lot of ZBrush throughout the year as well, as kind of my specialism, even though my background is a lot more in low poly work, as you would see from things like RuneScape and some of the mobile games that I've worked on. So today's topic, which is ZBrush for game art, sounds quite exciting, and it should be exciting, but it's not going to be a talk about how to work within ZBrush, I guess. It's not going to be like how to make a dragon skull or anything like that. It's much more about the pipelines, how you get your ZBrush model once you've made your lovely detailed sculpt and get that into a video game engine, so it can be part of a game and not completely cripple the frame rate of your project. So ways of kind of optimizing your models and creating textures that are going to go onto your high poly models, and then be able to optimize them enough to be able to get them to run within a game engine. And so when I originally planned to do this webinar talk, it was before the announcement of Nanite. I don't know how many of you would have heard of Nanite before, but that's kind of a new addition to Unreal Engine. It's really new, actually. It's in beta at the moment, and it's just it allows you to kind of import millions of polygons, which will make sense as I go through this talk, but really kind of dense, high resolution meshes, and be able to get them inside of Unreal, which kind of changes a lot of the way that we might essentially work with ZBrush when working in Unreal. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit throughout the talk, as well as what would be more of a standard workflow of what is commonly used at the moment for video games, which is generally to optimize things down to a light file size and get them to run well in frame. And like I said, I'm going to be covering quite a few different softwares and a few different topics throughout. So I really encourage you guys to ask questions throughout. And I will have plenty of opportunities to pause and answer questions, as some of the processes we do can be quite time consuming. When you start managing millions and millions of polygons, some of the things that we do will have some good pause moments. So there'll be plenty of opportunities for me to answer questions throughout, or anything that you are unsure of, or maybe you came to this talk with a specific kind of question in mind about ZBrush and workflows, and I'm more than happy to answer any of those questions as well as we go through. Cool. So without any further ado, let's get started. So ZBrush, what is ZBrush? It's a digital sculpting software used to create high resolution models and textures. It uses its own pixel technology, which is its own kind of algorithm for managing things like lighting, color, materials, orientation, and depth information for points that make up your object. So maybe if you're used to working with things like Blender or Maya or any other 3D applications, you're very used to working with polygons and vertices and triangles, whereas ZBrush uses its own pixel technology, which enables it to handle a lot more geometry than what you would inside of Maya. So I could use 50, 60 million active points, of which they're called, inside of ZBrush, and it's not gonna worry about it too much. But if you were to put that into Blender or Maya, you would have a pretty bad time. Is this webinar going to be available later to us? That is a good question, and one that I have no idea about. I think so. I believe that we release these on the Escape channel, but the first question I already can't answer, so that's not a great start. But I don't entirely know. Hopefully, I think they do. I'm pretty sure that they do go out on our YouTube channel shortly after the actual talks. But yes, cool. So moving along, let me get my slides moving. So what the topics we're going to cover today. So the topics are going to start with retopology. So what is retopology? The process of simplifying the topology of a mesh to make it cleaner and easier to work with. So if you don't understand what the topology of a mesh is, let me open up a wee web browser. We'll do some Google searching whilst I'm talking as well. So topology, just to find some nice examples of topology, maybe add a 3D on there just to make sure we're getting the right stuff. So generally it's the edge flow of a model. So what is good and bad topology? This is quite a nice image that shows that off. Bad topology tends to look like lots of triangles and weird shapes running through it. Anything with more than 4 sides to a polygon would be considered bad topology, whereas good topology has got nice flowing edges. It's all kind of moving in the shapes of the object. So you've got good circles around the mouth and around the eyes. And you've got the geometry where you want it because you know that certain things are going to deform. So the eyes are going to blink. So you want lots of points there so you can have good deformation of the eyes, whereas the forehead isn't really going to do much throughout. So it can be quite simple. So you tend to put the geometry where you want it, but you keep it clean and even for lots of reasons, really, which I'll talk about throughout today of why good topology is really useful. UV mapping being a good example of why good topology is good, because to UV map something, let's keep the Google searches going, shall we? UV mapping, just for those that might be very new to 3D. So a UV map is essentially when you've got your 3D model, you need a 2D version of which you can then paint on, and that's essentially mapped around the character. So if you think of, this is quite a nice example of a map being wrapped around a globe. It can be flat while you draw your map, and then you wrap it around your object. And so and these things can get quite complex when there's lots of parts to an object, like this mech, for example, that's got 3 sets of different UVs, but you can almost start to see some of the shapes in there. You've got kind of the body of it here, and there's some of the wheels and things, but essentially it's just a 2D representation of your 3D model, allowing me to draw here and see it appear over here. And that's going to be similar on all these examples. And I'm going to go through more examples as we go through, but essentially that would be part of your workflow. You'd be retopologizing, UV mapping, and then we'd have a look at things like ID maps. I shouldn't even close the window. What is an ID map? An ID map, essentially, you can use color selections to be able to assign different materials to parts of your model. So what we would do in ZBrush is we would, if we had something like this gun, you could color in, let's say, the leather bits, the metal bits, and whatever other parts of it. And then you can very quickly make these selections when you're doing your texturing. So if I wanted all of that yellow bit to be leather, I could do that very simply inside of Substance Painter. But as long as I define these things before I export them, I can very quickly go in and assign the right material to the right sections. And this can get quite fiddly when you start managing things like buttons on jackets and things like that, where it can be much easier just to make sure you've got a good color selection beforehand, and then you can very quickly sort of add your materials on top of that. And I'll be doing a demonstration of how these things work during the session. Next thing we'll be looking at is texture baking. So skip the slide. Texture baking, which would be to get your high poly model. So we're going to go into ZBrush and make a very high poly model, which will be in the millions. And then we need to be able to transfer that very dense mesh into a texture that we can then assign to our model, which again, it's going to make sense as we look at it. But what you have is a high poly model, a 1,000,000 polygon model, and then you have like a 1,000 polygon model, and you have the UVs for that low poly model, and then you can just transfer the detail as a texture onto that low poly model once it's UV mapped. And we'll be going over how that process works as well during this session. We'll have a quick look at Pbr Workflows, so physical-based rendering, which is kind of a new algorithm. I say new algorithm, it's been around for a few years now, and essentially it just more accurately recreates how lighting interacts with materials. So we have a slightly different material setup where you can get light to reflect properly off of objects, so we can fix what is metal and what isn't metal. And we have a kind of a scanned library of these things that are kind of already worked out for us. So what is the exact kind of color of gold, for example, that's been scanned, and we can pull that information and put it down, and we can work out what is the exact reflection values that you get from something like gold. And then we can assign that to our model and have it behave exactly as it would in the real world, the way it interacts with the lighting. And this is really cool, because previously when I was working on older games, you would have to manually kind of paint the specular highlights you get when lighting kind of bounces off of an object. And then if you were to change the time of day of your game, you would then have to retexture every asset to reflect this new light direction. But now using PBR methods, we can move lighting around all over the place, and models are going to behave accurately to how we've kind of adjusted things. And so that's really cool. Nanite, which is not something I want to go into extreme depth, as it is super new. It's only been around for a couple of months, and it's really exciting what you can do with it, because obviously you're then able to get from ZBrush these million poly models and get them straight into a game engine without kind of crippling performance. It will run quite happily with a trillion polygons inside of Unreal. I mean, it does come with some caveats, which we're going to talk about, some of the things you have to think about if you're going to be using that kind of approach. But really exciting, really interesting stuff that's coming out. And I'll put some links on the end as well of things that are worth reading up on, because this is going to be a big thing in the future of game development in the way that we kind of work with engines. Really, really cool. Nice. So that's the kind of things we're going to be covering for the next hour. These are some of the models that are part of a scene that I've been working on with one of my colleagues that I work with, Jordan, who did a talk earlier about materials. He might very well have shown some of this scene as well. It's just something that when we're teaching in the classroom, we try and do the projects the students are doing at the same time. So we were doing a Demon Souls DLC map. So the students were making a map for Demon Souls, and then we made a little room as well for Demon Souls at the same time. And so these were some of the assets that we were building. I thought they'd make some nice examples of using ZBrush for game art. But essentially what I'm talking about, so let me actually move ZBrush into the screen so we can see the interface. I'm not sure how many of you have ever turned on ZBrush. Let me just check the questions quickly. Is Nanite a technology used in Unreal or in ZBrush? So Nanite is a technology that's used inside of Unreal, and it's just able to manage the volume of geometry that we use inside of ZBrush. So for example, if I have a sphere, I'll just check on the screen quickly, make it a polymesh freely. You can see at the top, it's 8,000 active points by default. Poly count is, again, 8,000. But if I press Control D a bunch of times, you'll see that this poly count is going up. I'm at 520,000 now, 2 million, 8 million, and I'll do it again one more time. You really don't want any single asset going much higher than 33 million, because that's a really dense mesh. And ZBrush is one of the only softwares that can actually handle having this much geometry on the scene at any one time, up until Nanite came out inside of Unreal, where I could export this straight into Unreal and it would handle it quite happily as long as I import it as a Nanite mesh. And so what Nanite is essentially inside of Unreal, but a new algorithm for managing high poly models, mostly kind of designed around the idea of using scanned data. So things like photogrammetry, where you can go out and scan entire environments. You come back with very dense meshes, and those can be loaded straight into an engine. But yeah, so and what would be the difference between having this 33 million polygon model versus my first one, which was 8,000? If I was to draw on this or to do any sculpting on it, you can see I can make a shape, but it's a little bit low poly, it's a little bit noisy. It wouldn't look great as a texture or inside of an engine. You really want those extra levels of extra divisions to get it to be nice and smooth. If I drag that right up, it's going to go super high poly up to my 33 million, but this would allow me to do things like skin pores on a face, or like really, really kind of fine detail lines if I wanted to be able to. So and another bit of advice when working with ZBrush, you should never use a mouse. I do have a tablet around it somewhere, but it is a bit like drawing with a deck of cards. But yes, for doing very fine detail stuff, you can do that at a really, really high poly counts. Yeah, not great for inside of a game engine. And so to see this as an example again, let me grab a plane out of here. So like I said, this isn't a full-on introduction to ZBrush. There's lots and lots of videos out there on introductions to ZBrush, and it's something that I teach quite a lot, but that would probably dominate the hour session, and really rather focus on the exporting of it into a game engine, which which I will go through. But if I turn off my smooth divisions, make that a polymesh 3D, and I'm pressing Control D, which adds my subdivisions, I'll get that up to 16 million. And what I'll do is I'll load in a height map, which was one of the textures from the level, which is this one, a trim sheet. And what I can do with this is essentially just a black and white image, black representing down, white representing up, and grays are the gradients in between. And I can go down to my masking options and then just go to mask by alpha, and that will essentially draw that as a mask over the top of my cube, because it's just a square being mapped to a square. I think is it inverted? No, that's fine. For the example, and I'm just going to press W to move it, and I'll move it out a little bit, and you'll kind of see what you end up with. So because it's a mega high poly, I can have really nice kind of details on there, and the height information, the black and white information, is kind of what you get from using height maps. And this is generally how lots of detail is kind of added within video games. We tend to use zeros and ones and black and whites to be able to fake kind of depth on objects. Whereas if I was able to export 16 million polys into my game engine, I could start to kind of go around the corners, and I could remodel these blocks as actual blocks and replace them, and be able to get a lot more detail into here and a lot more variation, rather than just using the up and down values. Not that that's a big deal, so I was dragging across there. But to show you what I mean in terms of what you get from your poly counts, now if I go back to my geometry and drag it down one division level, that's at 4 million, and that still looks pretty good at 4 million. Actually, it's fine, and that's very acceptable. I think if I saw that inside of a video game, I'd think, yeah, that's a very detailed asset. At 1 million, still not really seeing much degrading of the quality. The difference between 16 million and 1 million isn't going to be massive on an object this size. Once I start getting down to 5, you start to see the quality starts to drop a little bit in places, starts to get a bit more pixelated. 4, 3, 1. And by the time you're down there, it's almost not recognizable as what it was originally. So showing you the real value of being able to have 1 million polygons versus a very low poly model, which is generally what you end up with in game, something like this. But you use the texture information to be able to fake the actual fine detail. We've never really been able to import things like this into a game, not up until Nanite was a thing, and now it allows you to kind of export this. And I could export this straight into a game engine and duplicate it about and make a pattern, which would be really cool. Nice. So that as an example, and let me open up the model that we'll be working with, which I'll be working with today. I'm just going to load in the door, not a traditional ZBrush sculpt. I mean, generally when you're looking at work inside of ZBrush, a lot of the time it's going to be characters, because it's generally used a lot inside of creating high resolution characters, dragons and things. I'm sure if I even do a quick Google search on ZBrush, I will be presented with pages of characters, and this is generally what it gets used for, doing really high resolution character models. You do see it used in games for stylized things as well, which can be really cool, and you do get environments as well, like doing doors and things like that. And I guess it becomes about what you're more comfortable with. I mean, you can do some quite complex hard surface things inside of ZBrush these days, and yeah, it's really, really powerful for doing both all sorts of modeling. You can even do cloth inside of ZBrush now for doing deforming cloth and things like that. Doing things like hair, this kind of thing, very difficult to get into a video game because it is a very dense mesh and might not behave quite as well. But generally, a lot of the time when I'm using ZBrush, it would be with characters in mind. But on this occasion, we're going to look at a door that I was making for the scene. So this door at the moment is 29 million active points, which transfers as 54 million polygons. So 54 million polygons, which would be difficult to work with inside of a game engine. You can, when I press on this polyline fill, it kind of shows you the edge flow of a thing. And you can start to see how dense the meshes are. And this is all the kind of points that are making up the shapes that we see on the final model. And so what I need to do is look at how I can kind of get this really nice detail, but inside of my video game and with a texture on it as well. As although we can do some texturing inside of ZBrush in terms of adding color and things like that, I tend to do a lot more of it inside of Substance Painter, which is set up for Pbr Workflow. So we're being able to add those material types rather than being able to either just paint flat colors onto the object, which is fine if you're doing, I don't know, something stylized. Maybe I can quickly look at a stylized ZBrush thing. Sorry, 1 second. It's that time of day when my children start to work their way into my room, so I'm just evicting one. Hopefully there won't be too much of a distraction going forward. But yes, no, it's totally maybe lost my train of thought. Oh yeah, I was saying about stylized things and how you could potentially texture paint them. So ZBrush stylized, we can have a quick look at the kind of thing that gets done. I'm spelled slightly wrong, but this kind of coloring in is very possible inside of ZBrush, as it's quite simple colors. You can project through textures as well. So there are a few different ways of kind of texturing inside of ZBrush, but we'll look at that later on. The thing I want to talk about the most today is kind of how we kind of use it for doing a Pbr workflow. So how I could get this 54 million polygon model into Unreal. So if I revert back to my slides, which are around somewhere, cool. So the first thing we probably want to do is to look at how we can get it into another program in order to retopologize it. So there's a few different ways of doing retopology inside of ZBrush, and that would be a decimation, which essentially would crunch the poly count right down and try and maintain as much of the detail on the surface as it can. And then I would move on to quad draw, which is a much cleaner way of doing a retopology, because you can lay the polygons out manually and really be able to put these where you wanted them. Let me just pause where there was a question. Are these functionalities you are going to explain available in ZBrush Core Mini version? Yes, exactly what I'm looking at will be you can do in whichever version of ZBrush. As for most of this session, I won't be looking at ZBrush specifically as more its transference into a game engine. I'm not entirely sure if the core version has ZRemesher, which is something I was going to talk about, and it essentially is another way of redrawing edge flow, and it does quite a nice clean job. I'm not sure if that's inside of in the core mini, but it was only something I was going to touch on, and it's not really a necessary. It's just quite nice to know about, as it's a kind of a clean way of redrawing your edge flow. But to start with, I'll look at Decimation Master, which is generally a nice way of being able to get your model down, because what you want to do first, before doing any decimation, is exporting your model out so you can bake it later on. So I would have to export all of this out as individual meshes, because if I look at my subtools, what you'll see is that this model is made up of lots of different parts. Things like the handle is its own separate thing, and that's 4 million polygons on its own. It's just quite a nicely duffed up handle. This kind of being the hinges on the side. And yeah, there's a few different elements that kind of make up the model, and I will need a few of them, but some of them I can get away with just kind of baking directly onto. And so I'm not going to go through and export all of these individually, as it would be very boring for you guys to watch, as it's quite a slow process. So I have exported them all before the session started, and I just went through and exported all of these individual meshes. The name's quite important as well. I don't want one at the end, but when you're working in a baking program like Substance Painter, it kind of looks for the names, and it will bake one to the other based on those names. So as long as it finishes _high, and then the low poly version finishes _low, it'll know which one to draw onto which. So that's quite important, and I will show that as an example as we go through. But we want the same amount of low poly pieces as we do high poly pieces. And there's good reasons why you'd want to separate it rather than having it as one big object. Firstly, I don't even think I could export 56 million out of ZBrush in the first place, as I tend to go to about 20 million, and then things aren't going to export particularly well. And I was also talking earlier a little bit about ID maps and the idea of using ID maps. So if I turn on these little paintbrushes, what you'll see is I've colored pretty much everything in. Some things aren't colored in, but the majority of things are, and there'll be reasons why I'll be able to get away with not coloring those in. But essentially, just to add these colors is quite straightforward. If I select my door handle, and I can just go to a color and grab any other color and just fill the object, it'll put color on the actual vertices. And this was for the reason I was explaining earlier, which I'll revert back to my slides as we get to ID maps around here, where I'm able to kind of make these selections and then assign materials based on each of these selections. And yeah, I will bake an asset and we'll have a look at how that works. But know that by adding these different vertex colors inside of ZBrush just means that I can quickly select that handle and go, okay, I want that to be metal, and I want this bit to be wood, and I want these screw heads to be metal, and vice versa. And then I can just select them all quite differently. Nice. So like I say, the thing you do next is go through and export all of these. If I look on my desktop, I think I made a little folder, a webinar folder. I have a door high folder, and in here I've got my door handle high. So I exported that underscore high, my door handle mount, my hinge high, and yeah, the panels and all the different elements all exported as underscore high. And then what I need to do is take this model into Maya so I can use quad draw. So I tend to use quad draw quite a lot because it, like I said earlier, it's kind of a manual way of plotting a different edge flow on your model. And so I'll show you how that works. But first, I'm not going to be able to bring a 29 million poly or 54 million poly model inside of Maya. So I need to reduce the overall poly count on this model beforehand. And the way I can do that is to use decimation. So Decimation Master inside of ZBrush can be found at the top here under Z plugin. I can use these little radial buttons. Why do you commute? Sorry, one question. I don't really understand why you'd commute texture to color. Why not just keep it as a texture? Well, it was never a texture in the first place. So I haven't actually got a texture assigned to this. It's just got a flat color on there. What I need to do is make a texture for it. So I'd put the color on first, just so I can assign which bits of this model I need to put the texture on, if that makes sense. So if I have a map that says, oh, this thing's yellow, I can later on go make a wood texture, a really nice Pbr wood texture in Substance, and go put it on the yellow bit, and then make a really nice texture. Yeah, making my textures inside of Substance and assigning them to these different colors on the model. So yeah, I've never had the texture in the first place, so I wouldn't be able to kind of keep it. But I do need to make the texture, and then I'll be able to assign it to those parts. Nice, hopefully that makes sense. Well, it certainly will do by the end of by the time I've gone through the demonstration, I'm pretty sure. Cool, so I've got my my model here, and that's just the handle on its own, and that's at 4.23 million. I might have some subdivisions that could make my life a little easier, so I'll just drag that down to 713,000, which is fine. And then I want to be able to use my Decimation Master to get that down to something much lower that I can bring into Maya. So I'll just dock this on the side. Go to my Decimation Master, which should be around here. And the way that Decimation Master works is you would click on the pre-process current first. And what that does is it will go through and it will calculate where all the points are on this handle. And then it will allow me just below it to remove it and leave a percentage. So if I was to hit decimate current now, I would be leaving 20% of my geometry. So it's 700,000 actual points. I won't do the math, so I'll hit the button. It'll leave me 142,000, which is a little bit better in terms of what I can export out and quad draw over. Again, I can hit pre-process current again. It should be slightly quicker if you do it a second time. And then decimate it down. And then that's down at 28,000. Cool, and that's much easier. Now I can work with that inside of Maya. So if I want to do that again with another model, like this one over here, just go through. And I've got this mesh at 1.something million. I can then have a look see if I've got any geometry there now. So I just hit pre-process current, and it will go through and calculate all of those points for me. And these ones have been relatively quick, but some of these larger ones, which are a bit more complex, would take a little bit longer to calculate. Luckily, again, I've already kind of gone through this process and exported it. So I was just going to show you the first two, and then I'll show you the reason why I'm doing it all with the existing meshes. But there we are. That's reduced it a tad. You can see it's gotten lower in its poly count by being at 300,000 now, and which is better. I'd still go a little bit lower just because there's no need for me to have it any higher than that. And then decimate current again. And then I'm down to 63,000, which is fine. Cool. So I have my decimated models and I have my very high res models. Let's pretend that I've gone through and hit decimation on all of these. And that's what you would need to do once you've sculpted your very high poly model. You do your ID map, you'll export them all out individually as high poly things. And then you can go through, decimate all of your models, and then bring that into Maya. Generally, once I've decimated everything, I could just merge it all into one model and export that. And that's what I'm going to bring into Maya. So if I open up Maya over here, which I have somewhere. Not saying that Maya is the only way to retopologize your model. There's a few other ones that are around, like Blender has its own retopology stuff. Some of them are more standalone plugins, things like Topogun. I think there's lots and lots of different retopology programs. Software. And it's usually just what you feel more comfortable with or what you've been using the most. But yeah, lots of different types of new poly builder tool in Blender. So there's, yeah, oh, don't let me start in videos, but yeah, lots of different processes, but this is the one inside of Maya. And so I was going to show you how that works, just so you can get to a lower poly model. So understanding what the goal is, I guess, would be quite important. So I'll just import the decimated model. So if I go to my desktop, I've got in here a decimation door. No, so this is that same door, but it's at in total 1,700,000. So still pretty heavy. Not something that I could put into a video game and have it run at real time. Generally, you'll get aiming for something a little bit lower, certainly for a door, and it's kind of excessive as well for the workflow that I'm going to use. So something much simpler would be better. I'll ignore the UVs, as I don't need any UVs at this point. But if I wanted to go through and quad draw this to get to my low poly, inside of Maya, you have this function at the top, this little magnet that goes no live surface. And it will essentially make the model a live surface, which allows me to plot points on top of an existing model. So if I go over to, I don't know, modeling toolkit, I have this function called quad draw. I can also access it up here. Then I'll scroll down a little bit once I've clicked on it. And it has all of its shortcuts and hotkeys all listed down here, which is quite useful. So you can kind of see all the different functions that it can do when it comes to drawing out polygons. Oops, I don't want to do that. We go from ZBrush to Maya too often. There we go, right. And so if I wanted to just quad draw on top of this, it's essentially just about plotting points. So let me go back to my quad draw. I can click here, click here, click here, and here. So I need 4 points to make up a quad. Then I can hold down Shift and just drop in a quad. And this is all kind of snapping to the surface. So I can move these points around a little bit, and they'll generally snap to the surface. So if I extrude off there, and that was just holding down the Tab key, and then run off there, I can start to kind of rebuild my model, but with a much simpler edge flow. And I think whenever I'm using things like quad draw, I really try and start quite simple, because once you get into very, very small points, it becomes a very time-consuming process of moving around quite small bits. But it's better to kind of start off with some big chunks and then work your way down to smaller ones. So generally, you want to go around and just redraw the model, but in a much simpler way. And we'll recapture all of this nice detail, but within a texture rather than using the geometry. So I can still continue all these parts over here. And if I do this top part, I can show you an example of the results that you would get as well, even off just a small piece. So with things like this, for example, you've got a nice pattern, but it sits on the surface. you can transfer the detail onto a flat surface, and then that's much cheaper to look at inside of, sorry, this is a quick question. Do you have any auto retopology tool or plugin for Maya? No, I don't even, I've never heard of such a thing. Maybe, what kind of things? There's a, what is there? Just an optimized mesh. It would probably be a bit random in the way that it goes about it. Let me see. I'm pretty sure there's a retopologize function. There's a remesh function. And these work pretty similarly to what is Dynamesh inside of ZBrush, which will just give you a big grid of quads rather than actually trying to follow the contours of the mesh. Using the actual reduction tools tend to make a little bit of a mess. There's something that's being developed, I think, more and more, that the idea of automated retopology. But unless you're actually looking at a thing, it's very difficult for a computer to understand what's important and what isn't. And that's kind of where you kind of need that human element. For example, as I was saying, when it came to this kind of pattern and design, you might start thinking, I've got to go in and quad draw all around this pattern and redraw it all. But you actually don't need to. You can just kind of cover the whole thing with one big plane, and then transfer all of that detail onto a single plane, because it will just be texture with normal maps and what have you, which I'll explain once I actually get around to baking. But yeah, I only really need to capture this section on a flat plane, which is far cheaper than if I was to try and even if I manually redraw all of that, it would still end up at quite a high poly count. But I can do a much cleaner version just by manually plotting out these points and really controlling where my edges are going to go. Maybe I can start to go around there, but right, so I can actually import the finished version as well, which I might do just so you can see what I'll be aiming for, which I have my door low. I import that and just grab that. There it is. Ooh, move it over there. Oh, I think it's trying to snap to my live surface. There we go. Cool. So this is what I would essentially go through and draw based on using quad draw. So I'll be able to map in the little points that go around here. I could probably just do like one and then duplicate it a few times, and the same down here. I'd probably just do one and duplicate it over to this side. A little more difficult to read because it's in triangles, but that's just through exporting. I can turn that back into quads if I want to mesh quads actually. Let's apply that. Cool. You can see it all more or less as quads, and I've kept it separate as well. So I've separated the pieces based on the high poly pieces that I exported. So some of these bits would be separate. So I didn't actually add that chunk to that chunk. I ended up exporting out this bit separately to the other parts. And really important when it comes to doing this process is that they remain in the same 3D space. So this object needs to be in exactly the same 3D space as this object. If I was to move one either way, I'm not going to be able to transfer this detail onto this object, because it works kind of like a sonar from a submarine, maybe, where kind of you get a ray that will bounce off your high poly, and then it will hit the low poly and it will transfer the detail that way. So if they're not in the same 3D space, it's not going to be able to transfer it from here to this object that's over here, because it doesn't really know where it exists. So it'd be important for me to leave that being right at the start. Cool. So quad drew my little bit, but we'll probably switch it out for our finished version just so we can move along and start looking at that idea of baking this mesh onto the other one. Actually, I'll just stop it moving. But essentially that would be a good way to go. You could just go in and quad draw all of your individual bits, and as long as they match the same bits that you exported and you've got a low poly version, you're then able to go on and start to do UV mapping, which was the next thing once you've actually made that low poly model. So there's quite a few steps that come from the point that you finish a really nice looking ZBrush sculpt to actually getting that to work inside of a game. And this would definitely be one of them, where you're going in and doing retopology. And sometimes you can get away with quicker methods, things like the ZRemesher or the decimation, or some automated process that you might be able to find. But sometimes it's just easier to go in and do it manually because maybe that's what you've kind of already done a lot already. When you already kind of know how long it takes you to quad draw a thing, it'll become a bit more of a predictable workflow, and you know how long it's going to take me to go in and build things. Some people won't actually, they'll start off with a simple model, so they might model this first and then take that into ZBrush and then start to sculpt on it, but then maintain the original version that they could then transfer back onto. But we're not doing that. I much prefer to work in a high poly first, make it as cool as I can, and then worry about the low poly after. So as I say, I was going to move on to talking about UV mapping. You can see that I've already UV mapped this, which is the process of taking your model and assigning it some 2D space. So I don't want my high poly. I'll get that out of the way now because I'm kind of done with that. The next bit will just be, like I say, making UVs for these sections. So you can access your UV editor inside of Maya using the UV workspace I quite like because you don't get a floating window. If I had no UVs on this, which I'll probably just wipe the UVs just to show you how you could start going about UV mapping a thing. I should not completely trash you. Start with a basic projection. So you get different types of projections for doing UV maps where you can select things, and at the top along this line I have a planar projection, cylindrical projections, and automated projections, depending on the type of object that you're mapping. So the majority of these things I'd probably do with just a flat projection, like a plane straight on, and just turn it into UVs based on this direction, whereas you'd end up with something like that. So if I select this and just do planar, it goes kind of straight on. It's not ideal, but after that, I would just go to unfold it, and then it will relax it out to a good shape. So if I shift right mouse, unfold, it'll then kind of unfold it in a way that would make a little bit more sense, or at least would relax it down to the shape. So you can see I've got both of them at the same time, but that's pretty much just UV wrapped that part of the object for me. Same with this one. I just grab it, do a projection from the front. Oh, I think I missed that. Do a projection from the front, and then it just needs a seam that runs all the way around it, so I can then break it up into two pieces. So if I just double click on an outer edge and then cut it, I can then grab them all. Ooh, stop clicking around the place. Grab them all and then hit unfold again, and it will have it in two sections, so it should at least be in two sections. And that one unfold. And that one doesn't want to unfold. Let's see why that is. Oh, have I got the other object now? Oh, I think I'm just selecting the wrong object. A professional. There we are. So I've got this piece, and this one again needs an edge cut around it. So I just cut there, and then I can grab that and unfold it as well. Cool, and then that's kind of unwrapped as well. And I can see that using these grids, they kind of show me what a 2D texture would look like on my 3D object. And you can see that if I rotate it around or scale it, you can kind of, if I get it to be kind of straight on, what you're looking for really is squares. I haven't really got squares on here, they're a little bit stretched. So maybe I'd have to add another seam if I was to go around and cut it there. Ideally, when you're putting seams in UVs, you want to put them in places where they're a little bit hidden. So I'll just cut there, and then I can unfold those two bits. Or even better than that would probably be just to cut it along one of these rows, maybe in an easily hidden place like there. I can cut that and then grab that and unfold that, and then you've got kind of a straight version of it, which would allow me to just draw on that, and that would be a little easier to work with. And you can pack it into a UV space a little easier. So again, yeah, I can just cut these things and unfolding them, and then eventually be able to find a nice relaxed pose for all of my parts. So let's go back to my original model, just because I would go through and obviously UV map all of those sections, but it would become the majority of our talk if I go through and do that. So let's say we've retopologized our model, we've done our UV mapping. We want to move on to the next section, which would be to bake out our textures. So texture baking. So what we're going to do is we've got our low poly model, and we've got our high poly parts that we've exported. we now want to be able to transfer that detail onto a texture. So you can see in this normal map as all of that interesting detail that I had on the high poly model, but as a texture. And this is the same for a curvature map, which is essentially picking out the edges of my high polyness, and that allows me to do things to the edges of my model, like adding edge wear and things like that. So it's able to pick out all of these sections for me. So I'm just going to open up Substance Painter, and hopefully this will all make sense as I bake it. But what you're seeing is actually quite a long process from getting, well, I say a long process, you get faster and faster at doing it. And the simpler objects are obviously a lot quicker. If I was doing a rock or a candle or something like that, it would be quite a quick process, whereas the door is relatively complex. So inside of Substance Painter, I'm just going to make a new project. I'll select the file, and what I want is my low poly model. So what I did inside of Maya is I had my model, which I'll import again, just so we can see exactly what I did before it got exported. I've quad drawn it to get a low poly version. I've UV mapped it. You'll notice that some of my UVs are sitting outside of this 0 to 1 space. So everything generally for a texture would sit inside of here. But some things you would put outside if they're repeats, if you want the same texture to be drawn twice, essentially. So I don't mind if the texture gets drawn once there, but it gets drawn again here, because all of these squares that you're seeing here are just repeats of whatever's going on in here. So you tend to move stacked shells one unit to the right, and that way they don't draw on top of each other. So it's a useful thing to bear in mind. So all of these meshes, they're all named _low. They've got the same first part of the name as my original model, and that way when I come to baking it, it's going to know I need to bake the handle to the handle or the door to the door. So actually played around with the name a little bit, but that should be fine as long as there's door _ handle high, which I exported from ZBrush, and I've got door _ handle low, which I've retopologized, UV mapped, and exported from Maya. I can bring all of that into Substance Painter. So here's my low poly door, which I exported, and I'll open it up, and we should see the same thing that we're seeing in Maya: the low poly door and the UV layout. So of what I made inside of again, inside of Maya, where I was laying out the UVs. And so the next thing you want to do is to bake your high poly to your low poly to get those details. So I can go to texture set settings, scroll down a little bit to where I've got bake mesh maps, click on there. I've got high definition meshes kind of highlighted here. And this is where I would select all of the uber high poly meshes that I exported out of ZBrush. So all of those high polys across there, I'll just open them all up at once, and you see they're all kind of in a row. That's the exact same amount of models that I've got inside of here, which I selected and just went File, Export, Selection as one model. And that way they're going to match up nicely. At the top, I've got my output size, so how big my bake texture is going to be. So at the moment it's at 512, but I can put that up to 2048, which is a decent size for a texture. I could go bigger than that, but again, it's going to take a bit of time to process, and I don't want to run out of time in the session. I'll scroll down. Things like anti-aliasing is quite nice to up. I'll probably put that up to 8x8, and that's going to really improve the quality of the image that I get at the end. And the next one down where it says match by mesh name, and that's where me adding the names is useful. I'm going to turn it off for the first one, just so you can see why I actually did the naming, and you'll see it as the error that will come up. The only other thing I need to do to this is IDs. So on the side here where you've got ID, I will click on that, and rather than material color, so a material color would be inside of Maya if I was to just assign a colorful material. But inside of ZBrush, where I've added the colors to the vertices, I actually want a vertex color rather than a material color. And so that would be the only, and that way it's going to draw that ID map for me as well. Cool, so that's all set up. I can just hit bake selected. This is where we have to look at this thing processed for a wee bit. I could revert back to my slides for a minute while that's thinking about it. Just again, just to refresh on what we just did. So in the first instance, you're going to go in, you're going to sculpt your beautiful high poly model in the millions and millions of polygons. You're then going to want to export all of those parts out, but with colored in sections, so you can have that ID map. You're then going to want to retopologize it so you can get it into a DCC package like a Blender or Maya in this case. So I used Decimation Master for that, which reduced the poly count considerably so I can import it in. I'll then use Quad Draw to be able to redraw my edges over the model and make it a much simpler version. Another reason why you'd want that really simple, because it was much easier to UV map. Similar to when I'm looking at what happens when I ZBrush things, which I get a nicer edge flow. And that would be much easier to UV map than to UV map this, which would be a bit of a pain. There's so many triangles and things that it's very hard to get good scenes out of the model. So you end up wanting something simple just because it's going to UV map a lot easier as well. Cool, so that was the UVs in the end. ID map I will show in a second, and this is what I'm hoping is going to come out of the other end when I look at substance, which it has, which is finished now. So you can see that it's now baked that detail. It's drawn all of the details that I had inside of Unreal, but onto my low poly model. And you can see here, it looks like it's actually got some shape to it. That's literally just normal map information, kind of faking the depth, because it is still just a completely flat surface here of what I had, rather than having what I've got in ZBrush here. Let's frame that, where it's all sculpted out and super high poly. And then I was just bake it down to a normal map. And I mean, obviously you lose a little bit of that detail when you stare close at it. But when thinking about the example in my game where it's third person and you're kind of at this angle, you're really not losing an awful lot, but you've got a much simpler model to work with when it comes to doing that sort of thing. So just looking at the different material passes, you can look at normal and height map, and that was the normal map, which is doing most of the deforming of the mesh, that's giving it that extra shape. But other maps that are of interest, I guess, world space normal, and that's just telling you what's the top and the bottom. And that's useful if you want to add things like sand or dirt and things that grow up the side of things. It can work that out based on there. Curvature, this was the map that's kind of showing you where all the detail is and picking out all of the smaller details and things. And I mean, the quality's not amazing when I zoom right in, but if I'd have baked that out at 4K or 16K, I could have had super high detail on all of these maps as well as I go through. I also haven't really drawn the wood grain on many of these panels, mostly just down here, as I could probably have just add them inside of Substance Painter, as I can continue to add more height information inside of Substance Painter. Cool. So also there should be an ID map there as well, which we'll look at. So that was the colorful version that I exported, and that's going to allow me to select things. So to show you how that ID map works, like if I go back to a material, I just wanted to drag on a smart material. I'm going to be pretty lazy with my smart materials today. And what we got? Materials, smart materials. And these are just kind of pre-assembled materials that you can use, but I highly recommend building up your own materials from scratch. It's a little beyond the scope of today's session, but definitely worth learning how to use Substance Painter and build your own materials. And so for me to just drag and drop that, I end up covering my whole model, as you can see, with this one material. But let's say I want to assign it to just some of these metal elements. I can now right-click on the layer that's on and go add mask with color selection. It would then come up with this window at the bottom, color selection. I can hit pick color, and I'll float over to these buttons because I didn't ID map the handle. But you can see I've now just assigned that metal to just these little buttons. If I wanted to assign it to the handle and I haven't got an ID map, there could be another way I could add that, where I just add paint to that selection. So if I want to add paint, and then I paint, maybe if I fill it in based on the UVs, I can click on these sections and then get them to fill in as well. Because they're kind of separate meshes, it becomes much easier to select them. So I can just click on them if they're separate. But with things like these buttons at the bottom, they were never separate. So I would have had to have gone in and manually hand painted the mask to leave the metal just on there. And so now I can also go and grab a random wood, and then we can add the rest of the door. Wood also got a bit of a directional issue with some of these things, when I can add more paint to these other sections as well, which probably need it. But that's just doing it based on the UVs. But again, I can add to my ID map if I pick a color and then pick all of the orange, and then pick all of these sections. And I'm able to add all of my metal bits to this door, and then the wooden bits to the other bits. And that was kind of the reason why I was adding the ID map in the first place, just to be able to do very quick selections and add metal to the bits that I want to be metal without having to go in and manually paint all of that stuff in, as it can be a little bit fiddly. Cool. So I'll open up the textured version as I wasn't going to do a full texture pass, but I'll just do a recent. Recent. We can have a look at the final door. Is that one? Cool. And that will be the finished textured door. It's got a few more layers going on, lots of blending of dirt and mess and things like that, but been able to kind of capture some additional wood details. So things like the normal maps that didn't exist on my original sculpt. So I didn't sculpt those wood lines into this section down here, but I was able to add it using the height map information inside of Substance Painter. So not to say that you have to add all of your detail inside of ZBrush. You can go in and add more detail inside of Substance, like for doing heights and high frequency stuff as well, and that could be quite a nice way of working. So the normal maps just like that. But if I look at this, you can see all the additional normal map information that got added through Substance. So that's quite a nice workflow. And the good thing about doing things in Substance is a little bit more forgiving. I can play around with the scale of things and turn things on and off quite easily. Whereas in ZBrush, once you've kind of sculpted things into the model, it's a lot more difficult to kind of adjust it or get rid of it unless you've really thought about it beforehand. Things like these lines that I put into the wood down here, if I wanted to change that wood type, it would pretty much be easier for me to start it again than it would be to try and remove it and add it again. I mean, I could flatten it down and then draw it out again. You can use some methods to store earlier versions and roll back to, but generally, once you've sculpted a thing inside of ZBrush, then it's sculpted and you have to blend it away and then sculpt over it again, rather than when you're inside of Substance Painter, where it's a bit more procedural, you can kind of keep chopping and changing your mind. And that's why sometimes it's quite nice to leave that fine detail pass to being inside of Substance. Cool. So moving on, once you've actually made that material, you just need to export that texture out. So it would just be a matter of going to export textures. You can pick out a template. I think I made one earlier, which is the Unreal Engine door. And you can see when you're working with Unreal Engine, you really want to stick to a good naming convention. So things like T_ for textures is quite good. BC would be for base color. ORM is occlusion, roughness, and metallic. And those maps we can see right here. Oh, let me cancel that. If I went to my metallic, and that one generally represents whatever's white is metal, whatever's black is not metal. Cool, so let's have a quick look at it in the game. As I see that time is really flying by, isn't it? What are we at now? 7, 6. Oh, right, so we've come very close to the end, where I always leave lots of time for talking and to talk a little bit about nanites as well. I really need to give myself 2 hours for these explanations, but it's a complicated workflow. It's something that you spend a couple of years developing on the course to get really good at, and to be able to be quite quick at making kind of high poly models and then being able to get them quickly inside of a game. But once you've got your finished kind of optimized model, then you can go in and just play this game experience. That's on your sword. Yeah, this was just the map that we've been working on, and that was that door that was sculpted in ZBrush, baked down, and then placed into the game, and then given some blueprints to have it animate and move around. But yeah, it's looking pretty decent, and you can't. Oh, it's closing on me. But there we are. Nice. So there's a few elements inside of here that were through ZBrush, but most of it's super optimized, very lightweight. It's all quite low poly. There's a couple of sculpted things, but we've really tried to be efficient, and that's something you look for really with when you're working in games, is getting as much reuse as you can out of the elements that you do. Things like this door is not so reusable, but certain things like these textures, you can see it kind of gets used again and again and again. Same as the columns, same as windows. But through the layering of things, you can really start to break it up and get variation. So you tend to start with things that are quite simple, but just build on top of it and add damage and layers of damage to it. I've got time to even talk about nanites. Well, I'll convert something quickly into a nanite just because I did want to talk about it a little bit longer, but I haven't really given myself that much time. But it's really new stuff. There is a cool link I'll leave in the chat just to talk about it, just because I might not have as much time. I did want to talk about that as well. Nanite inside Unreal. This is a really good link. Where can I put that where you guys would see it under the chat? All panelists and attendees, that should do. Cool. So you should see that link come through, and that's really useful. One, it's more the creators of the nanite talking about it, the breaking it down, how it actually works. And what you're seeing in these screenshots is all geometries. That's millions and millions of polygons, like 1 trillion polygons there to be able to generate this world. Similar with this is a part of Utah, I think, that was scanned completely accurately and then recreated in Unreal using millions and millions of polygons, essentially using like your original door mesh, as it would be, like taking this 54 million poly mesh and putting that straight into Unreal, which would be super cool. And it's just how much you benefit from it in a normal workflow, because it would be time consuming, but to export 53 million polys takes quite a while to get it in. It's got to be processed and then get into engine. And then there's also disk size as well. It ends up being a really heavy project. Like I'd recommend downloading the Utah project. You can find it on the Unreal Marketplace, and it really shows you nanites at work. If I've got that here somewhere, Marketplace. There. Yeah, it'll be under the games launch. That quickly. But yeah, I was going to show it at the end, but I started to download it. But it was big. It was like 100 gigabytes. But Valley of the Ancient, you can grab it off of the UE5 section on here, and it's just really a scan of that entire environment that you can fly around in, and you can see nanites working. But it has its caveats, things like trying to UV map a 53 million polygon model is pretty difficult, not impossible. I would thought I wouldn't be able to UV map the original mesh. I might be able to UV map the decimated version, which I could then take into Unreal and work with, because poly counts aren't such an issue. So taking that that decimated version that I had, if I open the scene, is this file? Actually, I have one that I started to UV map, thinking it would be a useful workflow, but I think it ends up being very high poly open to, or very time consuming to go through and UV map what will be this mesh that will load. The other one, but there it is. So yeah, I could go through and UV map this and run and put that straight into Unreal Engine at a very high poly count, and that already has quite a lot of the detail and things that were in there. And then I'd have to go through and bake that, and then still do a PBR pass on it as well. I would just have, I guess, a much more detailed silhouette on my final model than I get from this one. But the gain wouldn't be massive, I guess, and the time it takes to process it and get it ready, I guess you wouldn't have to retopologize. You wouldn't have to do the quad draw process, but UV mapping becomes longer. So I guess using the new technology and being able to put millions of polygons in, it was great, really exciting. But you can see why it's kind of in beta, and we're still kind of working out good workflows to be able to get the most out of being able to use millions of polygons. And some scenarios, like doing piles of rocks and things like you would do for that Utah desert, might be a little simpler and easier to get on with, certainly in terms of UV mapping a very high poly version of a rock. Might not be so difficult as it would be to do this, where you've got so many separate sections that you would then have to think about if you were doing it, yeah, for millions of polygons. But in a nutshell, essentially this is how we've been working with ZBrush for doing high poly stuff, and it would be the same for a character. You go in, you redraw the edge flow of the character, you UV map it, and then you bake that high poly character onto your low poly character. You wouldn't be able to get away with decimation so much on characters because you've got a deforming mesh, and triangles tend to not deform as well. Maybe when you're talking 20, 30 million triangles, you might not see it as much of an issue actually, and it might be fine. But yeah, essentially At the moment, we carry on kind of modeling things this way, retopologizing, baking down to get your detailed final map, and then get that into the engine and have it all run happily in frame. I will try and do another webinar in the future where maybe I'll do one more on nanites and how we can work with very high poly meshes straight into Unreal. But at the moment, I think that's pretty much what I'm recommending that you study up on in terms of if you want to be able to use it to get your high poly ZBrush interesting sculpts into a game engine. This is a very good workflow in terms of redrawing the edges, making those textures, and then reassigning it all inside of Unreal. The only thing I probably didn't actually look at, which I could show you quickly, was just the material setup, which when you actually bring those textures in, so this is what got exported out of Substance, as we saw these were the textures that were made. I tend to add a little bit of there, things that allow you to adjust the intensity of the normal map, the roughness on there, and the color tint, and you can see that with the texture on the model, and they're quite simple setups. It's just a power node, increasing the power. A flatter normal is a node that will flatten the normal, but because I've got a 1- inverting it, it allows me to give it a stronger normal map. If I select the model, I should have the instance here somewhere. There it is. It's got sliders that now relate to those things that I added, the normal map strength. So if I drag that, is it assigned to you? Oh. Still got a little laggy. Come on. Oh yeah, well, you can see the normal map strength went through the roof there, but it's because I dragged it up to 200. But these are things that I can adjust. Seems to be lagging a little bit now. 1 second. Yeah, things like roughness as well, like how shiny it is and how unshiny it is, and the tint would make it brighter or darker. I won't go into a very in-depth example, but it's a good idea when you're working with any materials inside of Unreal to try and give it some functionality that allows you to adjust once you see it inside of an engine. Cool, so I'm just going to quickly go through any questions that I've missed. Oh, tons, look at that, I wasn't scrolling down. 1 second, I'll quickly do these. So do you have, to what extent would you usually use texture instead of detail? Yeah, I mean, it can depend on the object. So for this one, for example, for me to retopologize this would have given me lower quality, because if I've got a quad draw over this, I'm not going to have it as high poly, so my curves aren't going to be as smooth as this. So the reason that I would bake that to a flat surface is because the texture is always going to have really smooth, even lines. So if I think I can get more quality baking to a flat surface than I would do a low poly version, then those would be the occasions where I definitely wouldn't retopologize it in the same way. I wouldn't bother doing the extra bits. So it's mostly floating parts, and there's different methods of approaching these, like I say, but generally, if the thing doesn't go any further than a centimeter away from the original mesh, then I don't bother retopologizing the screw heads, for example. I just do a flat surface over it and just bake it, and it'll be flat and it will look fine and clean. As in, okay, instead of details in what height? Oh yeah, so the height, yeah, about a centimeter away from the surface, 2 centimeters. It can depend on the game that I'm doing as well, if it's first person or third person, or how close I get to this actual object is going to determine how much detail I go into for doing it. But generally, any detail that's less than a centimeter, I'll always bake, because it's just not worth the effort of quad drawing around it and getting a slightly reduced quality by the end. Another question about retopology: what difference does it make following the flow of the mesh versus drawing only one plane? Well, in this instance, if I was to just draw one plane that went around here, I wouldn't be able to match the silhouette. So I definitely need some edges going across to get the curve at the top. I think I kind of answered the question, I guess, previously, where I'm saying by having a low poly version of this would give me worse results than it would be to just have it flat, because low poly would just be angles going around the circle, whereas flat is a perfectly smooth normal map. So it can be a lot of trial and error. That wasn't the first bake that I did of this door. It went back and forth a couple of times, and it was looking to go, oh, do I need geometry geometry to do this chunk, for example. Maybe I'd have got away with it. I think it's quite nice to have to frame things, so I like to have that ledge on the side. For these, I thought they looked a little bit more interesting just to model the extras. I probably didn't need to. I could have done that flat. I actually think that looks a little bit more interesting when you see it in the game. And the fact that it's connected to this, I thought it was a good idea to quad draw over that. Things like the screw heads I ignored. I added the heads on here, I think, as well. But not that I really needed to. I think just because I'd already added it on this one, I just duplicated that piece and used it on these parts. So easiest, I guess, isn't reducing quality. And you can see what I mean by having an angular low poly gives me angles here now, whereas if I'd have baked that completely flat to the surface, I would have got the perfect curve of the shape. But because I modeled it, I can't bake it onto a low poly model and maintain the quality. So I actually sacrificed some of the silhouette to be able to have that little bit of extra depth when I'm looking at that. Yeah. Hopefully that answers that question. I think it did pretty well. I think I should probably wrap things up as well. I'll get told off soon. So yeah, I think that's probably going to come to the end. I hope you found that useful, at least as a nice overview, and got you interested in working with ZBrush and being able to get that from start to end into an engine. Yeah, excellent. So I will wrap things up there. Hopefully you'll also see that video will get uploaded, and that's going to give you a nice overview of that workflow. And hopefully I'll get to do another one in the future as well, where we'll have a look at using mega high poly models and nanite, which is super exciting, and that with lumens as well, which is the new lighting system, which is equally as exciting as well, and time saving from some things that used to be quite laborious with making games is now becoming much simpler and a lot more user friendly, and it's much more about getting your ideas onto the canvas really and being an artist rather than having to go in and quad draw and do these kind of what feel like quite tiresome jobs, UV mapping and things. Everything is becoming automated for your generation, I think. I just about missed the boat. I think I had to do it all laboriously. But anyway, cool. Well, thank you for listening, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your week.